Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to our series, Studies in Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace and blessings be on each and every one of you. This episode, or this segment, focuses on Aqeedah. And this will be the first in that series on Aqeedah. We begin Aqeedah studies with Tawheed. Now, Aqeedah means, in general, beliefs, or the creed, the Islamic creed. Under that, we have the subheading, Tawheed. And this is what we'll be looking at in the first series of lectures on Aqeedah. Now, Tawheed, as I briefly mentioned in our introductory episode, it means literally to unite, to make one what was more than one. From the verb wahada, yuwahidu, tawheedan. And I should mention that you'll not find the term Tawheed in any Quranic text or in any hadith, not in that form. But you will find it used in the verbal form. The Tawheed really is the verbal noun. At any rate, the point is, Tawheed means literally unification or oneness. When we use it in the context of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it does not mean unification of parts, making them one, because Allah was not in parts, nor is He in parts, nor will He be in parts. He is one, unique in His oneness. He is one in His dominion over all things. He is one in His essence and His attributes. And He is one in His divinity and worship. Unique in that oneness. There is no other one like Him. So when we speak of Tawheed, what we're really addressing here is the maintaining of Allah's oneness. When we conceive of Him, when we speak about Him, when we worship Him, everything that relates to Allah should reflect the oneness of Allah. So it is maintaining that oneness in all of our dealings with Allah. Whether it is conceptual, as we conceive, we understand, we reflect. Whether it is in our actions, as we pray, as we deal with other human beings, as we deal with the world around us. We maintain that oneness throughout. This is really essentially what we mean by Tawheed. And its opposite is known as Shirk. Shirk literally means sharing, that something of that oneness has been shared. Something else, some of Allah's creatures, some other aspect of His creation has been given some of the uniqueness or the unique attributes which belong only to God alone. They have been shared with some elements of His creation. And this may manifest itself as a total disbelief in God, or as a belief in some form of idolatry, where one worships others besides God, or one worships intermediaries who they use to get to God. However it is done, it is called Shirk, and that is the opposite of Tawheed. Now, in order to study Tawheed in depth, scholars of the past have divided the subject of Tawheed into three basic categories. The first, which is called Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, or maintaining Allah's oneness with regards to His lordship, His dominion over all things, His sovereignty, that He has no partner or rival. Then what is known as Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, or maintaining the unity of Allah's names and attributes, affirming that there is nothing comparable to Him, that He is unique in His essence and His actions. Furthermore, the third category is that of Tawheed al-Ibadah, also known as Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, which is basically maintaining the unity of Allah with regards to His worship, His divinity, that He is the only one who is called upon in worship, whose forgiveness is ultimately sought, whose help is ultimately called for, etc., etc. So Tawheed has been divided into these three categories. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, which comes from Rabb, meaning Lord. Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, Asma meaning names, Sifat attributes. And Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, which is divinity, or al-Ibadah, which means worship. These are the three basic categories by which Tawheed is understood as a whole. Now, these three categories are not inseparable. They are a scholarly way by which a large topic has been broken down into components, but they're all part of the same topic. They're all interrelated. They all overlap. Just as a scientist or a doctor or a biologist or whatever studying the human body will break it down into its components. It will break the body into systems, down into systems. The skeletal system, the circulatory system, the digestive system, etc., the endocrine system, so on and so on, the muscular system, all of the various systems. But these systems do not exist by themselves. The skeleton is nothing without the rest of the body. The circulatory system is nothing without the rest. The nervous system is nothing without the rest of the body. So none of these systems can exist by themselves. However, in order to understand the human body and how it functions, scholars or scientists, etc., have focused on the different components to understand each component well, and then look at how they relate to each other. So though one may be studying a particular system among the human systems, one always has to keep in mind that it is a part of a whole. It cannot exist by itself. Similarly, when we look at the elements of Tawheed, we have to remember that they are part of a whole. They are all necessary for the whole to be real, to be a whole, but at the same time they cannot exist by themselves. So, now if we consider this kind of study, one may ask, why was it necessary to go into these kind of details? Isn't it just enough to say, yes, Allah is one, and just accept that, believe it, and carry on one's life on the basis of that? Well, in the time of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, when that message was brought, it was brought in its simplicity, without going into these kind of details, because these divisions, as I said, you'll not find them in the Quran, you'll not find them in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, explained as such. However, all of the information which is used to develop these various components, all of it has its basis there in the Quran and the Sunnah. But the question still arises, why in the time of the Prophet and his companions, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, didn't they get into these kind of details? You know, the first sort of generation, we don't really see scholars going into this in such details. Well, as I said, when Islam was first presented, it challenged the existing beliefs, which was shirk, idolatry, etc. It overwhelmed those beliefs, and the system of Islamic belief in the oneness of Allah was presented. It superseded all else. People accepted that, absorbed it. As Islam spread out of Arabia into Egypt, Byzantium, Persia, India, etc., and people there converted to Islam, they, in converting to Islam, did not cancel all of their previous beliefs and practices and then all of a sudden became Muslim. They came into Islam and they, on the basis of certain fundamental beliefs, and they would cancel and correct whatever secondary beliefs they held as time went on. Now, many of them came from cultures that had long histories, you know, in philosophy, whether it was from Christian philosophy, which existed in Egypt, for example. Alexandria was one of the philosophical centers, you know, of Christian philosophy. You had Constantinople, Byzantium, you had in Syria, you had in Palestine, Jordan. These areas all had Christian philosophical systems or mystical systems, etc., which had developed, you know, a whole set of ideas which were struggling and competing with each other. You had philosophers, Christian philosophers, arguing with each other about the essence of God and the divinity of Jesus, and a variety of other things they were arguing about. So they had a body of philosophical traditions, and much of this was taken from Greek philosophy, which was used as a foundation to express their ideas. Now, when Islam came, some of this was brought in with those who accepted Islam. Or people who did not accept Islam challenged certain Islamic ideas, and then these had to be responded to. Similarly, in Persia, Persia had its own system of beliefs which were based on Zoroastrian tradition, you know, which is an ancient religion which people had been following for thousands of years, which had developed its own sense, you know, concepts about God and how one should relate to God, etc. And when we went, also Islam spread into India, you find there another set of beliefs, Hinduism with its own philosophy, its own sets of concepts and ideas of how God is and how God is to be perceived, how does one relate to God. So as Islam spread to these various nations, overwhelming them and administering them, and the subjects of these nations eventually accepting Islam, they brought in with them a variety of different ideas. In the early days, when Islamic leadership was very strong, then these ideas remained under the surface. People, if they question from the point of view more of gaining more knowledge, correcting their beliefs, etc., etc. But after the time of the righteous caliphs, that's the first four leaders of Islam, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, their period of rule is referred to as the righteous caliphate. And they were followed by the Umayyad dynasty. And of course, in the initial stages, the early rulers of the Umayyad dynasty were, you know, trying to closely emulate the example of the period of righteous caliphate. But as time went on, they drifted farther and farther away from that ideal. And you then found a leadership which did not care very much about maintaining certain Islamic principles throughout the realm and insisting that it be followed, etc. You found more of a shift towards the worldly life and enjoyment and pleasure and these kind of things. So then the ugly head of corrupt philosophy started to rise. In the early days, as I said, some of that was attempted, but those early attempts were quickly dealt with. They were crushed. But in the latter days of the Umayyad dynasty, where the leadership became weak, then these ideas started to find expression. People started to call to different interpretations and different understandings of Allah, of what Tawheed constituted. Some of them reached the point where Tawheed meant to them that Allah virtually did not exist except in His name. They didn't want to attribute to Him any attributes. Others tried to claim that He was everything and everything was Him. Others claimed that He became eminent in His creation. He was present within His creation. And a variety of other ideas which really were contrary to the basic Islamic teachings. So what happened then is that scholars had to address these issues. If the leadership was not tackling the deviation and corruption which was arising, then the scholars had to stand up and challenge them. So as scholars arose to challenge these ideas, these new ideas which were being introduced, then a system was developed to deal with their ideas. You see, rather than trying to deal with each and every single deviant statement which is made, it was found to be better to combine these statements into various categories. Statements which had to do with God's divinity, which had to do with His names and His attributes, which had to do with His worship, and combine them into different areas, which would then be dealt with as an area as opposed to individual statements. And out of this process evolved the division of Tawheed, or our basic principle of Aqeedah, into these three basic parts. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, which represents the unity of lordship. Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, and that's the unity of Allah's names and attributes. And Tawheed al-Ibadah, or the unity of worship. And in our next episode in Aqeedah, we will be looking at Tawheed al-Rububiyyah in depth. We'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, Studies in Islam. And as was mentioned, this is a course of study. Please bring with you a notebook the next time that you're watching the program, and make notes if you'd like to follow it all the way through and to build a body of knowledge which you can then understand as a whole and be able to pass on to others, to share with others. And we welcome any questions that you have on what we are covering. You may send them in to us by writing to P.O. Box 111, Sharjah, UAE. And of course, that should be under the heading Islamic Studies. You can put my name on there also, Dr. Bilal Philips. And you may contact my office for copies of the syllabus that we will be using. The number there is 06 in Sharjah 5339 864. And you may also contact me through my website, bilalphilips.com. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.